Dad? Dad? Why is that lady singing happy birthday to herself?
I don't know, buddy.
She's all alone. On her birthday.
The wheelchair had not moved in an hour. In the corner of Sparrow's Cafe, beside a piano no one had played in years, a young woman struck a match and lit 24 candles, one by one, for herself.
Happy birthday to me.
The man hesitated. The boy did not. He was already walking. They stopped beside her table. She looked up, startled, the match still smoking between her fingers.
Excuse me, can we join you? No one should sing their birthday song to an empty room.
Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she was the only daughter of one of the richest men on the coast. She did not know that in 3 weeks, her father would buy the silent piano beside her, not to repair it, but to keep her quiet. She did not know that a stranger and his son were about to hand her back a voice she had buried 3 years ago. She only knew that a little boy was climbing into the chair across from her, grinning, a silver hearing aid catching the light.
I'm Milo. That's my dad. Happy birthday!
To understand what those two strangers walked into that afternoon, you have to know what silence had already cost her. Clara had learned to measure her life in the pauses between her father's phone calls. 24 years old, paralyzed from the waist down since a car accident 3 years earlier, she lived in a world of luxury that felt more like a soundproofed room. Her father, Gerald Whitfield, ran the largest shipping empire on the eastern seaboard. He moved fleets across oceans, but he could not find 10 minutes to sit with his only child. Before the accident, Clara had been a pianist. Her mother, Eleanor, used to sit on the stairs outside the practice room just to listen, and before every piece she would take Clara's wrist and tap the tempo 3 times against the soft inside of it. 1, 2, 3. So your hands know where the song lives, she'd say, before your head gets in the way. Clara had been 9 the first time it saved her. She'd stood in the wings of a recital hall with her hands shaking so hard she couldn't feel the keys, certain she'd forget every note the second she sat down. Eleanor knelt in front of her and tapped her wrist 3 times. Feel that? That's the song. It's already in you. You're not going out there to find it. You're going out there to let people hear it. What if I mess up? Then you mess up out loud and you keep going, and you know what everyone remembers? Not the wrong note. The girl who didn't stop. Clara had walked out and played, and she'd missed a note in the second movement, and she'd kept going. And afterward, her mother was crying in the 3rd row, not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. And she'd done it anyway. Her father had been there too that year, standing at the back in his work suit, watching the gesture pass between his wife and his daughter as if it were a language he almost knew. That was before he stopped coming. Before he decided a man could love his family best from behind a desk. But Eleanor never once asked Clara to be flawless. She only ever asked her to be heard. There was one piece Eleanor loved above all others, a slow, aching little nocturne. It was the song she'd been playing the night a terrified young Gerald Whitfield finally worked up the nerve to propose. It was the song she asked for at their wedding. And it was the last thing Clara ever heard her mother hum from a hospital bed 6 years ago, before the long illness took her. Something in Gerald went dark the day they buried Eleanor. He didn't become cruel. He became absent. He worked longer, spoke less, and never played her recordings again. He couldn't stand the sound. Then a truck ran a red light on a rain-slick avenue, and the accident took the rest. Clara remembered the floating second before the pain, the white ceiling and her father's face. Except it wasn't his face. It was his boardroom face, the closed one, discussing her care with the surgeons as if negotiating freight. The best facility, round-the-clock nursing, whatever the cost, as if she were a shipment damaged in transit, and the only question left was the price of making the problem disappear. She had reached for his hand once in that hospital room, in the middle of the night when the machines were the only thing awake. "Dad," she'd whispered, "stay, just for tonight. Don't go back to the hotel." He had squeezed her fingers, and she remembered that, the squeeze. And then he had said, "I'll have Renata come sit with you. She's better at this than I am." And he'd gone. He had not been able to bear the sight of her in that bed, and so he had solved the problem the way he solved every problem. He had hired someone else to be in the room. Clara had lain awake until dawn, learning the first and hardest lesson of her new life, that a person can be surrounded by the finest care money can buy and still be completely, echoingly alone. The doctors all said the same thing. She would not walk again. What none of them mentioned was that she'd also stop playing, because the piano needs feet as much as hands. She tried once, months later, and the notes came out flat and dead, unsustained, falling to the floor like birds that had forgotten how to fly. She closed the lid and never opened it again. After that, the mansion rebuilt itself around her like a beautiful apology. Ramps of imported stone, a lift disguised as a bookshelf, a nurse named Renata who was gentle and gone by 6, a staff paid to orbit her like moons around a planet no one visited. Every object met a need before she could speak it. And that was the loneliest part, because a house that answers you before you talk is a house that has stopped listening for your voice. She kept her mother's brass metronome on the nightstand and wound it some nights, just to have one honest sound in the dark, keeping time for her and no one else. Her birthdays became bank transfers, her holidays became text messages. And so this year she'd asked her driver to take her anywhere but home, and chosen a cafe with lace curtains and a dusty piano, and bought herself a cake, and prepared once again to be alone. Then the door chimed. The man who sat down across from her carried his grief differently. Elias Hart was 32, a piano tuner, a widower. His wife, Grace, had been a music teacher, the kind who could quiet a room of restless children with a single chord, and she died of leukemia 4 years ago when Milo was 3. He had married her young in a courthouse with $11 between them and a borrowed ring. She used to say a marriage was 2 people agreeing to keep tuning each other for the rest of their lives, that nobody stays in tune alone. He hadn't understood it until she was gone and there was no one left to turn toward. For a year, he'd tuned other people's pianos and let his own life fall silent. It was Milo who brought him back. A small boy who needed breakfast and bedtime stories and a reason every single morning to get up and make a sound. There had been one morning in that first gray year when Elias could not get up at all, when the weight of the empty side of the bed pinned him flat until the sky went pale. A 3-year-old with his mother's eyes had padded in, climbed onto his chest, put both small hands on his face and said, Daddy, I'm hungry. 3 words. They had done what no counselor and no casserole had managed. They had given him somewhere to be. He got up. He made pancakes shaped like nothing at all, and Milo declared them the best pancakes in the history of the world, and Elias laughed for the first time in months and then cried into the batter. And the boy patted his arm and said, "It's okay, Daddy. Sad and happy can share." He never knew where the child got it. Grace, probably. She was always saying things like that, and the boy had kept them the way a piano keeps a song long after the last note has faded. Milo had been born early, and the same struggle that nearly took his life had taken most of his hearing. He wore an aid in each ear, small and curved and pearl-colored, and he'd learned young that the world didn't slow down for a boy who heard it differently. He knew what it was to sit in a full room and still feel unheard, which was perhaps why he noticed the quiet ones. The people alone in corners, the ones whose smiles never reached their eyes. They'd been coming to Sparrow's for weeks. The owner had finally decided to have the corner piano tuned, and Elias had taken the job, an hour at a time. That was the small, ordinary reason 2 strangers walked into Clara's silence on the afternoon of her birthday. But some coincidences feel, in hindsight, deliberate, as if a room that has gone quiet for years will eventually call for the people who can fill it. "We come here 'cause my dad's fixing the piano," Milo announced, pushing a small, wrapped cupcake across the table. "I made this one. You put the candle in the middle so the wish goes straight up." Clara looked at the cupcake, then at the boy studying her the way his father studied a keyboard. "That piano hasn't worked in years," she said quietly. "That's 'cause nobody listened to it," Milo said, as if it were obvious. "You look like how it sounds." "Milo," Elias said softly. "No, a good way," the boy insisted. "Like nobody's listened to you in a long time, but that's not the same as broken. Dad says out of tune isn't broken. It just means somebody has to sit down and pay attention." The word slipped under a wall Clara thought she'd sealed for good. When was the last time someone had chosen to sit with her? Not scheduled, not paid. "He's not usually wrong about people," Elias said, his voice warm and careful. "Milo, do you know what a birthday needs? A song." And so Milo began to sing, in the loud, fearless, slightly off-key of a child who's never once worried about being off-key. After a moment, Elias's low voice joined him, finding the harmony underneath. The few other patrons glanced over and smiled, but Clara barely saw them. Her whole world had narrowed to this table and these 2 people who had chosen, for no reason at all, to see her. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in 3 years, made a wish. It was so small it almost hurt. She didn't wish to walk. She'd stopped wishing for that long ago. She wished simply to be heard. She blew out the candles. 24 flames surrendered their light, and the smoke rose straight up, the way Milo had promised. Make a good one? He asked. The best one, she said, surprised to find it was true. Here is the thing that surprised her most in the weeks that followed. She did not wait to be invited back. A few days later, on an afternoon she knew Elias wasn't even scheduled to work, she had her driver take her to Sparrow's anyway, just to sit near the piano, just to be in the one room where, for an hour, she'd felt like a person instead of a problem. She was alone at the corner table when she reached out and rested one finger on a single key. She did not press it. She only sat there, her hand trembling above it, the old fear rising, the flat dead notes, the closing lid. "You don't have to play," said a voice. Elias was in the doorway with his tuning case. She hadn't heard the bell. "Then why did you open it?" she asked. The lid, she realized, was already up. He must have left it that way. "Because not playing should be your choice," he said, "not your fears." She looked at the key a long moment. Then she pressed it. The note came out sour and half-tuned, but it did not die on the floor. It wobbled and it held, just a little. And Clara sat very still and listened to it fade, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 3 years loosened by a single degree. "Can a piano still matter?" she asked, "if it can't sound the way it used to?" Elias sat down beside her and looked at the old upright before he answered. "Every instrument I've ever loved was one somebody gave up on. The sound changes. That doesn't make it worth less." What neither of them knew was that they were being watched. Out on the wet sidewalk, a man in a very expensive coat stood at the cafe window and did not go in. Gerald Whitfield tracked his daughter the way he tracked everything. Through the phone in her bag, through a driver's dutiful reports, and today, for a reason he could not have named, he had come himself. He had told his own driver to wait. And through the glass, he had watched his paralyzed daughter lift her hand to a piano for the first time in 3 years, and he had seen her face when the note held. Something crossed his own face then that had no name in any boardroom. His gloved hand closed slowly into a fist, and when Clara, inside, tipped her head back and laughed at something the little boy said, laughed in a way Gerald had not seen since before the accident, he turned from the window as though the sight had burned him, and walked back to his car, and told his assistant to find out everything there was to know about the man who owned the tuning case. He did not tell anyone what he had felt. He was not sure he had words for it yet. Inside, Clara knew none of this. She only knew that she had started coming back. They fell into a rhythm. Elias adjusted the cafe chairs so her wheelchair fit before she ever had to ask. Clara read aloud to Milo in the corner, a different voice for every character, and the boy rested his head against her arm to feel the story through her sleeve as much as hear it. Some afternoons, she pressed a few notes on the old upright while Elias worked, and Milo named each one. "That's a happy one. That's a scared one. That one's just tired." She began saving things up during the long gray days at the mansion. A line from a book, a joke Milo would love, just to have something to hand them when she arrived. She hadn't saved things up for another person in 3 years. One evening, Elias pushed her chair down to the river, and they stayed until the light went long and gold across the water, while Milo waged war on an indifferent swan. "Can I ask you something rude?" Clara said. "Those are the best kind. Why do you do it? The tuning. Nobody sees it. Nobody claps. You fix the thing and you leave and the person just gets to play, like it was always fine." Elias thought about it. "That's the whole reason, I think. When I do my job right, I disappear. The person sits down and forgets there was ever anything wrong. They just hear the music." He glanced at her. "Grace used to say the best kind of love is like that. Invisible once it's working. You only notice it when it's gone." Clara looked at the river for a while. "My father loved me like a line item," she said. "Very visible, line by line. Nurses, doctors, ramps. I could have read my whole worth off an invoice." "That's not love," Elias said quietly. "That's accounting. They rhyme, but they're not the same word." She laughed, a startled, wet sound, and Milo came running back to demand they settle whether the swan was a spy. And the afternoon closed over the ache in her chest like water over a stone. And then came the Friday that changed the shape of everything. Sparrows held a small, open evening on the last Friday of the month that a few folding chairs, a plate of cookies, anyone who wanted to read a poem or sing a song. Milo had been practicing a simple tune for weeks, a little piece his mother had taught him before she died, the only thing of Grace's he could still hold in his hands. Elias had promised to sit right up front where the boy could see him. But when Milo climbed onto the piano bench that evening and put his fingers on the keys, one of his hearing aids gave a thin electronic whine and went dead. Then the other. The batteries both at once. The room dropped away from him into a muffled underwater hush. He froze. He could see the keys, but he could no longer hear the count in his own head. He couldn't tell where the beat was, where to come in, whether he was early or late or playing at all. His small shoulders began to shake. Elias was pinned at the back of the room behind a row of chairs, too far to reach him in time, and a whole cafe of kind faces was starting to turn to worry. Clara moved before she decided to. She wheeled hard across the floor, up beside the bench, and she did the only thing she knew, the thing her mother had done for her 10,000 times. She took Milo's small hand off the keys, turned it palm up, and tapped the tempo 3 times against the soft inside of his wrist. 1, 2, 3, then again, 1, 2, 3, steady, sure, a beat he could feel even in a silent world. Milo looked at her, and Clara held his gaze and kept tapping, and mouthed the words, "I've got the beat. You just play." He played. He couldn't hear a single note of it, but he could feel her hand on his wrist, keeping time the way a mother once kept time for a girl who would grow up and pass it on, and he found the song through her fingers and carried it all the way to the end. When the last note fell, the cafe erupted, and Milo, who could not hear the applause, felt it come up through the floor and through the piano and through Clara's hand, still resting on his wrist. Across the room, Elias stood with one hand pressed to his mouth, and the look on his face was no longer the look of a man grateful to a kind stranger. It was something deeper and more frightened and more certain than that. Later, when Milo was asleep against Clara's shoulder with his dead aids in his pocket, Elias sat down beside her. "You saved him tonight," he said. "My mother did it for me," Clara said. "I didn't even think, my hands just knew." "Milo and I aren't here because we feel sorry for you." Elias's voice was rough. "You know that, right? He hasn't drawn himself in a picture in 2 years, not since his mom. Last week he drew all 3 of us, flying." He looked at her. "You didn't just let us in, Clara. You started keeping time for us. Nobody's done that since Grace." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The cafe had emptied out. The owner was stacking chairs. Rain ticked against the dark window. "I was so scared up there," Clara admitted. "For him, I forgot to be scared for myself. I forgot the chair. I forgot my father. I forgot all of it. There was a boy who needed the beat, and I had it." She looked at her own hands as if they belonged to someone braver. "I haven't been needed in 3 years, Elias. Do you know what that does to a person? Everyone takes such good care of you that you stop being any use to anyone. You become a thing that gets tended. Tonight I wasn't a thing. Tonight I was the one who kept the time." "You were," Elias said. His voice wasn't quite steady. "You always were. Somebody just had to hand you back the chance to prove it." Clara looked down at the sleeping boy, at his small hand still curled loosely near her wrist, and understood that somewhere in the last few weeks the accounting of her life had quietly reversed. She was not only the one being cared for anymore. She had something to give, and she had given it. And the giving had felt more like standing than anything her legs had ever done. That was the night she set herself a goal she told no one. She wanted to play, again, really play, a whole song, not a single note. Her mother's song. She started practicing in secret on the old upright in the empty hour before Milo got out of school, and it was Milo who, watching her hands reach for a pedal her foot would never find, asked the question that set his father to thinking. "Dad, can you make a piano pedal you push with your hands?" Elias looked at his son, then at Clara's hands, then at nothing at all, the way a man looks when an idea has just walked in and sat down. That night he stayed in his workshop long past midnight, an old salvaged sustain assembly spread under a single lamp, sketching a mechanism on the back of an invoice. A lever, a spring, a way for a hand to do what a foot no longer could. He didn't tell her, some gifts you don't announce, you just build them quietly, an hour at a time, the way you tune a piano. But happiness, for people like Clara, had always come with a countdown. The folder landed on Gerald Whitfield's desk in plain manila. Elias Hart, 32, widower. A piano tuner, a man who fixed other people's instruments by the hour, who rented rather than owned, whose net worth wouldn't have covered a month of Clara's care. To Gerald, the conclusion arranged itself like a balance sheet. There was only one thing a man like that could want from a girl like Clara. That, at least, was the story he chose. It was easier than the other one, the one about a window and a single note, and the thing he'd felt on a cold sidewalk watching his daughter come back to life in a room he hadn't been invited into. He summoned her to his study, a long room walled with monitors, stock tickers scrolling red and green across the dark. "You'll end this," he said, not looking up. "The arrangement, with the tuner, immediately." His name is Elias. I don't care what his name is. I care what he's after. He looked up and his face was closed. He's using you, Clara. What else could a man like that want from someone like you? The words went in like a blade. Someone like you. You mean your broken daughter, she said quietly. The one you can't look at because she reminds you your money couldn't fix a single thing. He stood, the tactic that had folded competitors in half for 30 years. I'm protecting you. They see me, Dad. A 7-year-old took one look and knew I hadn't been hurt in years. It took a child 5 seconds to do what you haven't done since Mom died. Something flickered in his face. Then the shutter came down. Enough. If you keep seeing this man, I'll have lawyers argue he's exploiting a disabled woman. I'll make sure no one in this city ever hires him to tune so much as a doorbell. That workshop of his will be gone by spring. His voice dropped, worse than shouting. Is that what you want? For him? For his son? She had watched her father dismantle men for less. She thought of Milo's hand under hers, of a song half built in a workshop she'd never seen. That night she wrote the hardest words of her life. I can't see you anymore. Please don't contact me. I'm so sorry. She read it 11 times, each like swallowing glass, then sent it and pressed both hands over her mouth so no one in that enormous house would hear her break. But Gerald did not stop at threats. He believed in actions, in taking the board off the table so the game couldn't continue. And he knew exactly which object his daughter had begun to build her small, dangerous new life around. 2 days later, he made a single phone call to the owner of a struggling cafe on Ashwood Lane. He bought the piano. He told himself it was strategy. Remove the object, end the obsession. He did not let himself think about the window, or the note, or the truth sitting underneath it like a stone at the bottom of a well. Elias read the message in his workshop and did not understand it. He read it a third time, waiting for the words to rearrange into something that sounded like Clara. They stayed cold and flat and final. Milo found him in the dark hours later. Dad, why are you sad? Miss Clara can't see us anymore, buddy. The boy went quiet a long time. But she loves us, he said finally. Not a question, a fact. She keeps time for me. And very deliberately he took the aids from his ears, first one, then the other, and closed them in his fist. I don't want to hear the house be this quiet. Across the city, Clara was learning that a silence you choose is heavier than one done to you. She didn't leave her room. Once, in the small hours, she read the last message Elias had ever sent her, a photo of Milo asleep at the cafe table captioned with one word, heard. She looked at it until the screen blurred, because beneath the story she was telling herself, that she was being noble, that she was saving them, she knew the truth. She was choosing silence because it was safer than the sound. She had become, in 3 days, the very thing she'd spent 3 years grieving in her father. Renata found her on the second morning with a breakfast tray she wouldn't touch. You should eat, Miss Whitfield, the nurse said gently, professionally, the way she'd said it 1,000 times. And Clara, who had never once snapped at the staff, who had spent 3 years being politely, invisibly grateful, heard herself say, Do you like me, Renata, or do you just get paid to sit in the room? The nurse's face went still. She didn't answer because there was no answer that wasn't a wound, and both of them knew it. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. That wasn't fair. But the question hung there afterward, and Clara understood she had finally asked out loud the thing she'd been afraid of her whole life. Whether anyone at all would stay in the room if the money stopped. She had found 2 people who would, and she had just sent them a text telling them not to. On the 4th day, everything broke open at once. It broke because of a text, not from Elias, but from Marta, the old cook, the only one in that house who still thought of Clara as a girl and not a liability. Mija. Your father bought the piano from that little cafe. They move it to storage in the morning. He was taking the piano. The stubborn old thing she'd pressed a single note on and felt for 1 second like herself again. He couldn't reach into her chest and take the feeling, so he was taking the object. He was doing the only thing he'd ever known how to do to something he couldn't control. He was making it go quiet. And something in Clara, bent low for 3 days, did not break. It snapped, the way a string wound too tight for too long finally finds its pitch. She went to the service elevator, down through the belly of the great cold house to the kitchen, where Marta took one look at her face and opened the back door without a word. Go, mija, she whispered. Go be heard. The rain had already started. Clara didn't care. Her arms burned as she pushed down the drive and out the pedestrian gate the guard hadn't thought to watch. Streetlights smeared into gold ribbons in the wet, and the city rolled past her, enormous and indifferent, and still she kept going. because for the first time in 3 years, she was moving towards something instead of being wheeled away from it. She wasn't going to say goodbye to a piano. She was going to put herself between her father and the last place her voice had lived, and for once, she was going to be loud about it. By the time she reached Sparrow's, she was soaked to the skin, arms shaking, and she was not the only one who had come. Elias's old truck sat crooked at the curb, because that morning Milo had pushed his cereal around his bowl and asked the question that broke his father open. "Dad, does Miss Clara not want us because we're not rich?" And something in Elias had straightened, and he'd said, "Get your shoes, put your ears in." They'd driven to the mansion, been turned away at the gate, and drifted back here, to the one place that still felt like hope. She pulled the door open, and the bell rang, bright and clear and alive, like a single note that holds. "Clara!" Milo was across the room before anyone could move, arms around her wet middle. "You came back! I told Dad you would!" Elias rose slowly, taking her in, soaked, shaking, more awake than he'd ever seen her. And without a word, he pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You're freezing. What are you doing here?" "He's taking the piano," she said. "My father bought it. They move it in the morning." She looked up at him, rain and tears indistinguishable. "And I'm done being quiet so he doesn't have to feel bad." The piano was already half shrouded, a moving blanket over one end, a clipboard of paperwork on its lid. That was when the door burst open hard enough to make the bell jump on its hook. Gerald Whitfield stood in the doorway, rain-soaked and shaking. He'd tracked her through the GPS on her phone. His tailored coat was ruined, his silver hair plastered flat. "Clara, this is finished. You're coming home, now." The room froze. Elias began to rise, moving to put himself between them, but it was Milo who stepped forward first, all 7 years and 50 pounds of him, planting himself in front of the towering man. "You're mean," Milo said. Gerald blinked, thrown the way powerful men are always thrown by the one weapon they never learn to counter. "Little boy, you don't—" "My dad is sad too, but he stays. You don't understand, I'm protecting my daughter. You have a big house." The boy's chin came up. "But Miss Clara is still alone." Gerald's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "That's not protecting," Milo said. "That's hiding." The truth from a child's mouth hung in the air like a struck chord. And then Elias did the thing no shouting could have done. He walked past Gerald, quietly, the way he moved toward any instrument neglected too long, pulled the moving blanket off the old upright, lifted the lid, and looked at Clara. "Go on," he said softly. "Let him hear it." Clara wheeled to the piano her father had bought to silence. For one heartbeat, the old fear rose. Then she did something she hadn't done in front of anyone in 3 years. She lifted her right hand and, with 2 fingers, tapped the tempo 3 times against the soft inside of her own wrist. 1, 2, 3. Behind her, Gerald Whitfield made a small sound, like a man stepping on ground that isn't there. He knew that gesture. 3 taps on the inside of a wrist. He had watched Eleanor do it to Clara 1,000 times. At the little upright in their first apartment, at the grand piano in the house he'd bought to make her proud. He'd forgotten he remembered it, but his body remembered before his mind did. A cold, falling feeling, the floor tilting. And Clara began to play. Not a single note this time. A song. The song. The slow, aching little nocturne her mother loved, the one Eleanor played the night a frightened young man proposed, the one she asked for at their wedding, the last thing she ever hummed. It poured out of the old cafe piano, imperfect and half-tuned and utterly, defiantly alive, and it filled every corner of the room, and it did not fall. Gerald Whitfield stood in a doorway in the rain and heard his dead wife's hands in his living daughter's. 6 years he had kept that song locked in a room he never entered. 6 years he hadn't let himself hear a single bar of it, because to hear it was to stand again at the foot of a hospital bed and lose her all over. And now, here it was, from a piano he'd bought to make silent, played by a daughter he'd tried to manage into stillness, with a tempo tapped on a wrist exactly the way Eleanor used to tap it. His legs went out from under him. He caught the back of a chair and lowered himself into it, and this man, who had folded competitors in half across boardroom tables, put both hands over his face and wept like something breaking. Clara played the last phrase. She let it hold. She let it fade. And into the silence her father said in a voice she had never heard him use, "I stood outside that window." She turned. 3 weeks ago, I came myself. I don't know why. I stood on the sidewalk in the cold and watched you lift your hand to this piano, and I heard you play one note through the glass. His breath shook. And do you know what I felt, Clara? Not worry. Not fear that some stranger was using you. He raised his eyes, and they were a ruin. Jealousy. My own daughter found her voice again after 3 years, and it wasn't me who gave it back. It was a cafe, and a stranger, and a little boy with hearing aids. And I couldn't stand it. So I did what a coward does. I tried to take the sound away, so I'd never have to hear what I'd lost, and how little of it was mine. I didn't buy the piano to protect you. I bought it because I couldn't bear that you were happy, and I wasn't the reason. The cafe had gone utterly still. It was Elias who spoke. Without anger, the way he spoke to instruments everyone else had abandoned. You're not a monster, Mr. Whitfield. You're a man who's been out of tune for 6 years and forgot it could be fixed. Your daughter doesn't need your money or your protection. She needs the one thing you've been too afraid to give her since her mother died. She needs you to listen. Clara wheeled to her father and, for a moment, took his hand. When I woke up paralyzed and terrified, she said, I didn't need the best surgeon. I needed you to hold my hand and tell me we'd figure it out together. That's all I ever needed. Her tears fell freely, and she let them. I'm not a problem to be solved, Dad. I'm the last piece of her you have left, and you shut me in a soundproof room so you wouldn't have to hear her in me. He gripped her hand like a drowning man who's felt the bottom rise to meet his feet. I'm sorry. Clara, I'm so sorry. I turned you into a project because I couldn't bear to see you in pain, and I caused you more pain than the accident ever did. But Clara did not melt into it. She held his hand, and she also held her ground, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady in a way it had never been in that house on the hill. I hear you, she said, and I forgive you enough to let you try. But that doesn't mean everything is fixed tonight. You don't get me back with one apology in the rain. You get a chance. You'll earn the rest the way I earned this chair. One hard day at a time. And the first thing you're going to do is call off your movers and let go of this piano, because it was never yours to take. For a long moment, Gerald looked at his daughter, really looked, the way he had at the window, except this time she was looking back. Then he took out his phone, and in front of all of them, he made the call and canceled the movers and told the cafe owner the piano would stay. It was always going to be hers, he said. I think somewhere I always knew that too. Milo, with the flawless timing of a child who feels a storm pass, tugged at his ruined sleeve. Does this mean we can be a family now? 'Cause I already decided Miss Clara's gonna be my mom, and you'd be a grandpa, he frowned. Do you know how to be a grandpa? A wet, startled laugh broke out of Gerald Whitfield. No, he admitted. Not the faintest idea. He looked at Clara. But I'd like to learn, if you'll let me earn it. One note at a time, Clara said. We'll see. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was better than that. It was a beginning with conditions, which is the only kind that ever holds. The year that followed did not erase what Gerald had done, and Clara did not let it. There were hard sessions and harder silences. He came to her physical therapy and learned to help with the exercises. And more than once, she sent him home when an old coldness crept back into his voice. But he kept coming back. He stepped away from the company, handing the reins to people he was learning to trust. He drove out to Elias's workshop on quiet evenings and let the younger man put a tuning lever in his hand, and slowly, a string at a time, a visit at a time, a father earned his way back into a daughter's life. It was not smooth. 3 months in, over dinner, he slipped, said something about a specialist in Zurich, a new procedure, the best money can find, the old reflex to fix her with a checkbook. Clara set down her fork. There it is, she said quietly. You did it again. You looked at me and saw a problem with a price tag. The table went silent. And this time Gerald did not defend himself, and he did not go cold, and he did not leave the room. He put his hands flat on the table and made himself sit in the discomfort. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. Old habit. Tell me, what do you actually want from me tonight? It was the first time in her life her father had asked her that. I want you to ask me about my day, Clara said. And then I want you to just listen to the answer, all of it, even the boring parts. So he did. He sat in a chair for 40 minutes and listened to his daughter talk about ducks with invented names, and a device Elias was building, and a song she was almost brave enough to finish, and he did not offer to fix a single thing. When she was done, he said, That's the best 40 minutes I've spent in 6 years. And she believed him, because he'd finally learned to say things that couldn't be wired to an account. And Elias, in that same year, finished the thing he'd been building in secret. One afternoon the following spring, Sparrow's Cafe was strung with white ribbons, and the old corner piano, tuned now to perfection, gleaming, no longer silent, waited beneath a fall of light through the lace. It was Clara's 25th birthday, but more than that, it was her wedding day. She'd chosen to marry in the place where her life had truly begun again. The guests were few and real. Elias's fellow craftsmen, a handful of friends Clara had rediscovered, Marta weeping in the front row, and Gerald, who had asked, not assumed, asked, whether he might walk her down an aisle made wide enough for her chair. "You look so like your mother," he whispered, walking beside her. "She'd be proud of you too, Dad," Clara said, "not for what you were, for what you're becoming." Elias's vow was plain and true. "Clara, you taught me love isn't about finding someone perfectly in tune. It's about finding the person whose broken strings and yours make a sound neither of you could make alone. I promise to always listen, not to your chair, but to you." Clara's vow undid the room. "You and Milo showed me the parts of me that don't work were never the parts that mattered. You gave me back a sound I thought I'd lost. I promise to keep time for this family for the rest of my life." When they kissed, Milo cheered so loudly the whole cafe burst out laughing. And then Elias wheeled her to the piano. He fitted the thing he'd built, a small mechanism of levers and felt and brass. The salvaged sustain rebuilt so a press of Clara's hand could hold the notes her feet no longer could. The answer to a question a 7-year-old had asked out loud a year before. He stepped back and nodded. Clara tapped the tempo 3 times against her wrist. 1, 2, 3, and she played her mother's song. It poured out rich and whole and sustained, until 4 bars from the end the device caught. A lever stuck. 1 note dropped out from under her hand and fell dead to the floor, exactly the way every note used to, in the music room, in the dark, in the worst year of her life. The room held its breath. Clara's hands paused over the keys. And then she smiled and kept playing. She let the dead note stay dead. She played on around the gap, and the song limped and soared and finished anyway. One silence built right into the middle of it, and it was somehow more beautiful with the whole than it could ever have been whole. Because that was the truth Milo had told her on the very first day, the one she'd needed a year to believe. Out of tune is not the same as broken. You don't have to be perfect to be heard. You only have to keep playing past the notes that fall. Gerald wept openly. Milo pressed his hand flat to the piano's wooden side, feeling the sound the way he'd learned to feel everything that mattered. And when the last chord faded, no one moved. They simply sat inside the good kind of silence. The kind that comes after a room has been filled. Until Milo began to clap, small hands high over his head, and the whole cafe shook with a sound it had waited years to make. At the reception, when the fiddles had gone quiet for a moment, Gerald Whitfield stood and tapped a spoon against his glass. The room turned, braced perhaps for a rich man's speech. It was not that. "I spent 30 years," he said, "believing the strongest person in any room was the one who needed no one. My daughter taught me the opposite, and it cost her 3 years of my absence to do it." He looked at the piano, and then at Clara. "A year ago, I bought that instrument to keep my daughter quiet, because I couldn't bear that she'd found her voice, and I wasn't the one who gave it back. Tonight, I watched her play a song with a hole in the middle of it and finish anyway, and it was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." His voice broke. "Elias, thank you for hearing what I was too frightened to hear. Milo, thank you for telling me the truth at full volume, with your ears in." The room laughed through its tears. "And Clara, you didn't forgive me because I cried. You made me earn it, one day at a time, and you were right to. Your mother always said I worked too much." He raised his glass, and for the first time in 6 years, he let himself smile at the memory instead of flinching from it. "She also said it's never too late to learn a new song. I'm a slow student, but I'm finally listening." The whole cafe rose with him. They named the baby, when she came 6 months later, Eleanor Grace Hart. Eleanor for the woman who used to listen on the stairs. Grace for the one who painted a house with music. In the hospital room, Gerald held his granddaughter with trembling hands and, without quite meaning to, began to hum, low and slightly off-key and unmistakable. The nocturne. Clara heard it and said nothing. She just closed her eyes and let her father sing her mother's song over the newest Whitfield, and understood that the sound had finally made it all the way home. Milo leaned over the bassinet to tell his baby sister the single most important fact in the world. "In this family," he whispered, "nobody sits alone. Not ever, okay? Okay." Clara had once sat in a cafe and sung Happy Birthday to an empty room. She had wished over 24 small candles only to be heard. She got a family that would never let her sit alone again. And every note of it, even the ones that fell, held.